Most students of history know that Magna Carta, the Great Charter of Liberties, placed the English king under the law. They know that this charter, agreed by King John in 1215 at Runnymede and confirmed in definitive form by Henry III in 1225, is a crucial document in England's history, likely the best known of all documents surviving from medieval England. Its attempt to impose laws limitation on a ruler is summarized in its chapter 39. No free man shall be taken or imprisoned, or dispossessed, or outlawed, or exiled, or in any way ruined, nor will we go or send against him except in the lawful judgment of his peers, or by the law of the land. Less familiar is the role of Magna Carta in the centuries after 1225, when it was taken up periodically as a banner of discontentment by subjects who rallied against the monarch or their programs for political reform. That includes calls for reconfirmation, for independence, and ultimately for abolition. The British traced the roots of this form of government to the early 1200s. At that time, nobles forced King John of England to sign the Magna Carta, a document that took away some of the king's power. King John's attempt to appease the restive barons that were angered by his feudal tax demands. The document spoke largely to feudal rights, the protection of the barons, and provisions for finance. There was very little reference to the people's right under the common law. It also granted that the king was subject to the law. That is known currently as the rule of law, and taxation was by consent only through the Regency Council of Barons, an institution that is today's Parliament. It also established the concept of trial by pairs. Today, that is known as the jury trial. The Magna Carta has also had a significant impact on the study and practice of the law, not only in England and Wales, but also in the young colonies. In fact, it provided the first laws that lawyers were able to study when it was published in 1508. It established a judiciary for the first time that was independent of the king, and for that matter of the church, the ecclesiastical courts. The constitutional implications of the end of the period of entitlement to a period of bills and statutes. That was the origin of the parliamentary prerogative, or the supremacy of the legislature over the executive. And that remains a legacy, and perhaps the greatest legacy of the Magna Carta, that is enshrined in the laws of England and Wales, and more so in the United States. For their legal training, law students relied on legal primers and editions of the work of lawyers such as Sir Edward Coke and the famous William Blackstone. William Blackstone is responsible for many of the early laws that made their way across the Atlantic to the colonies. In fact, one young Thomas Jefferson wrote to a friend of his exasperation on reading pages of Coke, "I do wish the devil had old Coke, for I am sure I never was so tired of an old dull scoundrel in all my life." Nevertheless, his ideas, as taught by the Virginian judge and law professor George Wythe, had a profound influence on the thinking and future author of the Declaration of Independence itself. So as we'll see, the rule of law actually took root in the colonies. Those 13 colonies that were ultimately to become the United States were actually founded by British settlers under the auspices of a colonial company, and those companies granted land and legal rights through the Crown under what was called a charter. Many included interpretive clauses of the Magna Carta itself, especially as regards due process and all the rights of Englishmen. For example, the Virginia and Massachusetts Bay Charter are almost verbatim taken from the Magna Carta. They made clear that emigrants and their children will enjoy the liberties and franchises, immunities of an English subject, a free English subject. In fact, the rhetoric of the Magna Carta provided the ammunition that led to the demand for independence in 1776. Both the rallying cry of no taxation without representation and the Declaration itself that proclaimed that even the king must be subject to the law could be traced back to Runnymede. So then the Magna Carta, led to the Petition of Right and the Bill of Right. It was adopted in the colonial governments, many of which actually based their first laws on the Magna Carta. The criminal laws of many of the New England colonies were based on the Magna Carta as well as the Old Testament scripture, because they had a significant amount of independence once they were granted the charter to institute their own laws. On this basis, the Magna Carta became more of a basis for laws in the colonies than it was in England, where there was still a very strong royal prerogative. Abolitionists in the 19th century had a conundrum on their hands. On the one hand, they had the U.S. Constitution, which guaranteed equal rights to all men, while on the other hand, there were statutes that guaranteed to keep minorities enslaved. They looked at the Magna Carta as their inspiration in the framing of the constitutional amendment that made slavery illegal and made slaves equal under the law. The 14th Amendment owes much to the language that comes from the Magna Carta. The influence of the Magna Carta ebbed and flowed through the centuries. And during the 18th century, and at that time when the United States declared independence of Britain in 1776, it was a hot-button topic. The famous case of newspaper publisher John Wilkes, who had used the Magna Carta to fight for his freedom from imprisonment after having made comments against the king, was ripe and ready for ferment. The United States took this principle at hand, and this is part of the reason why freedom of the press was instilled in the young colonies. The cry of freedom for people all around the world owes much to the legacy of Magna Carta, the exercise of due process under the law, and equity of individuals in the eyes of the law. It was used extensively in the push for the extension of adult suffrage, as a charter based on the Magna Carta was used to fight against the imperious power and give men the ability to get the vote. Again, suffragettes used the Magna Carta in the 1900s to secure the votes for the women. Throughout the British Empire, similar results have occurred, where subjects have pushed for the right to be equal to British citizens. The Declaration of Fundamental Human Rights, the proclamation of the United Nations, also owes its wording to the Magna Carta. Although very few of its clauses remain applicable to British law, it continues to inspire people the world over. It is indeed a wondrous and wonderful document. On this, the 800th anniversary of the signing of the Great Charter, Magna Carta, it's a wonderful opportunity to get familiar with what it means to all democracies that celebrate the rule of law and the rights of the individual, man's right to due process under the law. 800 years is a significant achievement and one that should, in fact, be honored.